But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Trish, who is a 2018 fellow. Now, she has a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of New South Wales, and she currently works at the Australia Council for the Arts as the head of First Nations Arts and Culture, and she provides strategic policy and funding advice to First Nation artists and arts organisations in Australia. Now, she travelled across to Panama, the USA and Switzerland, and her topic was to investigate the protection of Indigenous cultural rights in Panama and the United States. Now, she comes to us with a wealth of experience. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from her. She's worked with Sydney City Council, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel, the Moogarland Performing Arts Board. She's connected with Intrepid Travel, Beyond Blue. She worked at the World Intellectual Property Organisation in Geneva as the Indigenous Intellectual Property Law Fellow. She's also worked as a lawyer at the Arts Law Centre of Australia and National Indigenous TV, and she's a published author. I mean, what more could we want? So, Trish, I'm just going to fiddle in the background and try and get it so that everyone else disappears off the screen. But if you're on speaker view, I'm going to mute myself and then I'll hand over to Trish. And once Trish starts speaking, she should fill your screen. So thanks very much, Trish. I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Good evening, everyone. I'd firstly like to start off by acknowledging that we're all meeting tonight on different Aboriginal lands, and I acknowledge all the different lands that we're zooming in from, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their custodianship and knowledge. I also acknowledge any First Nations people who are here on the meeting tonight, and I myself am zooming in from saltwater country in Sydney, Bidjigal and Gadigal country. And as I'm also a Watathi and Mabiok Islander woman from the Torres Strait via Townsville, and now obviously Sydney on Bidjigal country. And as Ian mentioned, I've worked as a lawyer, advocate and strategist in the First Nations arts and cultural space for the last 15 years. So tonight we're going to have a casual conversation, Jo, Morwenna and I. I'll let them introduce themselves. So each of us will do a sort of high-level discussion about our fellowships, which we're really fortunate enough to be able to take pre-COVID overseas, obviously. But we really came together. Thanks. We really came together over our passion for the arts and cultural sector and really wanting to make changes in the sector. So we've met a couple of times over the last year over a couple of Aperol spritzers, pre-Sydney lockdown, of course, and thought it'd be a really great idea to have this chat about our findings, our research, and also to look at some issues that are occurring at the moment in the arts and cultural sector due to obviously COVID. So we're sort of focusing our discussion. We've got three main questions which will focus on the effects of COVID in the arts and cultural space, diversity inclusion as well as the future of the arts. So this chat will really be a high-level discussion. And if you'd like more information about our research and reports, please refer to the Churchill Trust website. So I will now pass over to Morwenna, and then Jo and I will both talk about our fellowship aims and some of our recommendations, and then we'll each lead a discussion followed by questions. But feel free to ask questions either in the chat or at the end of the session. So Morwenna, I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the wonderful intro, Trish and Ian, and so nice to see everyone here. It's lovely to be with you on this Monday night online. So I'm going to introduce myself briefly, and then we're each going to kind of do 5 minutes telling you a little bit about our very extensive fellowships in 5 minutes before we get into those kind of three key questions for the discussion. But for those that don't know me, my name's Morwenna and I'm an arts consultant specialising in diversity, access and inclusion. I also identify as a person with disability, and I have a background as a classical musician, studying at the Queensland Conservatorium on flute many moons ago now. And I've had a long career working in arts funding agencies. So in fact, Trish and I were both working together when we were awarded our fellowships in 2018 at the Australia Council for the Arts, which is the national arts funding and advisory body. And at the moment, as a consultant, I work with lots of different arts, culture and screen organisations. Too many to list, but one of my main gigs at the moment is as interim CEO with Accessible Arts, which is our state arts and disability peak organisation advocating for the rights of people with disability within the arts. And I suppose my personal background as a musician, and then my interest in the area of arts and disability led me to go, why is the music industry in Australia not as up to speed as some of the other art forms when it comes to disability? So here in Australia, we've got a disability theatre company, Back to Back. We've got a disability dance company, Restless Dance. We've got lots of visual art studios with incredible visual artists with disability, but we didn't have a lot in the way of music or music organisations or programs for people with disability. So that was one of the things, I guess, that drove me to my Churchill Fellowship, which was to explore inclusive music organisations, venues and festivals which actively engage people with disability. And the research question that I had was, how can our Australian music industry here include more disabled artists, participants and audiences? And I did this by spending some time in the US, the UK and Ireland. And I chose those countries because they all subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which says that people are disabled not by their impairments or conditions, but by the environment and society around them. There's fairly strong political movements around disability rights in those countries, and they've also got reasonably progressive thinking when it comes to the arts as well. So back in 2019, the end of 2019, I set off on my research travel period, sneaking it in just before COVID, very luckily, 60 days, 2 continents, 3 countries and 17 cities. And I talked to 125 people from 72 organisations via 83 interviews. And if that wasn't grueling enough, I did it while I was on maternity leave with a 6-month-old, leaving Australia with a 6-month-old and my obviously very, very supportive partner, and came home with a 10-month-old. So that made the trip all the more exciting and very memorable. And my goodness me, Theo, my son, has been on 16 flights, I think, in his first year. So thanks, Churchill, for that. The organisations and people I met with came from 5 different groups. So I really wanted to spend time speaking to disabled musicians to hear about their experiences. I talked to music organisations who were running programs with and for and by people with disability. I talked to festivals and I talked to venues, and I also talked to some music training institutions to see how are they growing the next generation of musicians and making sure that people with disability can be a part of that. So a couple of examples or highlights from great organisations I had the privilege to spend time with. The Kennedy Center in Washington, major performing arts centre in the US. The Barbican Centre in London, another multi-arts performing arts centre. The Edinburgh International Festival and Edinburgh Fringe, Manchester International Festival, and some fantastic disability music organisations such as Drake Music and the Para Orchestra in England, who actually opened the Paralympic Games back in 2012. So there was a range of different cross-cutting themes that I heard about on that trip, and just to share a couple of those with you. The organisations that were doing this well very much had disabled people front and centre in the decision making around these programs. They were collecting and using data really well to try and measure whether the programs that they were doing were having success. They were thinking about access, not just from an audience side of things, which tends to be where people start because audiences are in some ways easier, but they were really also thinking about artist access and how we can make sure that disabled artists have the same opportunities as non-disabled artists. They also worked really closely with artists to show them how to make their work accessible. And they made sure that they programmed really thoughtfully and inclusively and put disabled artists on their stages. There were some really interesting ways that I observed that organisations were doing audience access. And in fact, Grace, just before we started this session, mentioned one of them, which is this idea of relaxed performance, which is really big in the US and UK, and we're starting to see a bit more of it here in Australia. Another thing that's really common in this space at the moment is dementia-friendly performances. So I was able to see quite a few examples of those. And the final kind of cross-cutting theme was around assistive music technology. So there's some incredible advancements in the tech space around disability, of course, and then music and disability too. So lots of new potential ways for disabled people to make music and be creators, not just audience members. And that was something I was particularly interested in. And just to, before I hand over to my colleagues, there were my Churchill report talks about 5 success factors for inclusive music organisations. And those 5 factors are, first up, just to start somewhere. So do something, even if you can't do it all at once, and have this idea of achievable accessibility. What are some of those quick wins that you can make happen right now? The second success factor is around research and listening and seeking feedback. It's about doing your homework. It's about finding your community, getting to know what they need, and paying disabled people to share their experiences with you and expertise with you. The third success factor was around improving organisational culture and responsibility. So trying to embed this idea of access and inclusion in the bones and the foundations of an organisation and just make it part of everything that you do. The fourth factor was around planning and improvement. So getting access as a line in your budget, getting it in all your project planning templates so that it's built in and you can't forget it. And the last success factor was around the need to connect with others doing good work in this space and keeping on learning. Access, you know, the world of access changes and moves really rapidly, particularly in the tech space. So keeping up to date by networking, upskilling and collaborating with others was really important. So that's a very whistle-stop tour through my, my Churchill. And again, you know, thank you to the Churchill Trust for your support of this project. And yeah, it's been incredibly life-changing for me and my 2 colleagues speaking tonight as well. And what I'm going to do now is hand over to Jo to tell you a little bit about herself and her fellowship too.
Thanks, Morwenna. Thank you, Trish, for your acknowledgement. I'm also joining you all tonight from the unceded Gadigal Bidjigal lands of locked down Sydney right now. And it's really such a joy to be having this conversation with Morwenna and Trish, as Trish inferred. You know, these conversations started, I think, when we met for the first time when we were being awarded our fellowship, and the opportunism with which we've kind of attacked these conversations over Aperols or over Zoom have been really really fruitful, I think. And yeah, in a moment when there's so much uncertainty in the arts, it's really encouraging to have colleagues working across different parts of the sector coming together to brainstorm, complain, come up with ideas. So, but like Morwenna and Trish, I've worked in the art museum and arts sector for a long time now, but specifically for the last decade, I've worked in education and public programming in museums and galleries with a specific focus on young people and informal engagement programs. So I had a number of years overseas in London, and at the time of doing my fellowship, I was the Young Creators Coordinator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia in Sydney. My fellowship was looking at different models of informal and youth-led engagement in different arts organisations in North America. I had 56 days. I can't even come close to Morwenna's kind of terrifying stats, but I did visit 8 cities and I had 49 meetings with 33 different arts organisations, and a lot of teenagers. And I focused on North America specifically because youth programs in museums have been really common practice there for decades now. And I didn't know it at the time, but the teen internship program at the Met in New York actually started back in the 1960s. So they've really been innovating for a long, long time. Since the 90s, there's been a lot of work around this sort of idea of a museum kind of teen council. So that was really my point of departure, or my way in, I suppose, given who I was working with in terms of teenagers at the MCA at the time. But I was also really interested in a lot of the work and conversations that were happening across the US and Canada around this framework called creative youth development, which is a holistic model or framework that really recognises how creativity-based programs can support the key developmental tasks of adolescence, which is to form an identity, to master and develop life skills, and to find a sense of place or community, which were things that I sort of intuitively understood, but obviously didn't really know about or have the language for until I undertook my fellowship. And I had 8 aims for my fellowship, which was ambitious, I think, but you know, some of them were very specific to the context of working within a museum, you know, around funding and evaluation and you know, how to better advocate for the value of youth programs and having young people in your buildings. But in the context of what Morwenna and Tricia and I are really keen to chat about tonight, I think some of the more relevant aims and kind of findings were really about where and how these kinds of programs are able to meet young people at the different stages in their lives and development. And the really diverse ways that they're set up to respond to different challenges that young people are facing emotionally, socially, culturally, educationally, as well as obviously encouraging creativity and participation in the arts. And another aim and kind of finding for me was really around the richness of kind of cross-sector collaboration and the different kind of programs that sat at this intersection between arts, health, education, justice, and really blew my mind to sort of come across programs that specifically engaged with and supported young people in the juvenile justice system, young people experiencing homelessness, first generation migrant young people applying to college, and programs specifically for queer young people of colour. And these programs were run by major institutions like the Brooklyn Museum, MCA Chicago, but also by really small, like funding hand-to-mouth community, not-for-profit local arts organisations. And then the last sort of finding that I think I'd really like to kind of come back to over the course of our chat tonight was around some of the really deep research that I uncovered and was guided towards around the long-term impacts of participating in these youth-led and youth-centred programs. And this was research that was really able to quantify over decades in some instances the benefits of participating around increased emotional intelligence and increased critical thinking skills, improved college readiness, right through to reduced rates of recidivism amongst young people caught up in the justice system. So many findings and opportunities and applications, which has been really, COVID's brought a whole nother level of urgency and kind of focus to a lot of that. But yeah, it's a really interesting, tricky moment, I think, for young people. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, and working with young people, you learn to be really flexible and adaptable. So there's some really good lessons in that too, of navigating and surviving COVID. But I might leave it there and hand over to Trish to talk a little bit about her fellowship aims and findings.
Great. Thanks, Jo and Morwenna. So my topic was really to look at specific laws that we see in the US and Panama. So obviously with my background, I'm really passionate about the protection of Indigenous cultural IP rights. And so I really focused on those aspects in the 2 countries that I went to, as well as Switzerland, which you know, is the sort of centre of international human rights for many people. And there are a lot of international forums where Indigenous peoples meet. And at WIPO, there's specific sort of discussions going on at an international level to protect Indigenous culture and knowledge at that international level. And so my research really focused on looking at these specific laws and how they really protected Indigenous cultural IP rights. because obviously in Australia we see still a lot of exploitation of Indigenous art and culture as being a really big problem. And we really sort of need to move forward and implement new laws to fully protect Indigenous art and culture. So this law would look at protecting, you know, communal ownership of stories, that passing down of knowledge of art, designs, songs and dances, and it would also stop outsiders from exploiting Indigenous culture for commercial and harmful use. And so actually one of my cousins, Denisha Duff, who's based in Brisbane, she's also a Churchill Fellow. So probably about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, she really encouraged me to think about applying for a fellowship. And so I really sort of thought about it for a couple of years, and then obviously I applied and was successful in being able to go overseas. And I was really sort of happy because it is a very competitive process. So I was very happy to be able to have this opportunity. So I wanted to go to Panama because I also had a really close Kuna colleague. So the Kuna people are one of the Indigenous peoples in Panama. And the Kuna people are very sort of fierce advocates for their rights, their cultural rights, their land. And so a lot of Kuna people and advocates and lawyers go to some of the human rights forums in Geneva. So I'd met this guy Estebancio in Geneva, and he would always tell me about we have this law in Panama that protects Indigenous art and culture. And so I'd heard him talk about it a couple of times, but I didn't really know that much about it. And because of the language barrier, you know, obviously everything's in Spanish, I wanted to go there myself. And he really helped me translate a lot of the interviews from Spanish into English. So that was really sort of why I wanted to go to Panama, to learn about their culture, to meet different Kuna people and to learn more about their law that was implemented back in 2000. This law is called the Special System for the Collective Intellectual Property Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Panama. And then I'd also heard about the Indian Arts and Craft Act in the US, which was implemented way back in like the 1930s. And if you think about the history of the US, that's a time when a lot of Native American people were being, you know, pushed off their lands, killed. They weren't allowed to speak in language, practice culture. And yet at the same time, they had the implementation of this consumer sort of based law that would protect Native American people, Native American artists and artisans to create their work and to be economically sustainable from their work. So I was really sort of, I almost went down this kind of tangent looking at the sociological and history of what was happening in the US, why this law was implemented, and you know how it sort of works in practice, particularly because there are so many different Native American communities across that country. And so, you know, I didn't go to as many countries as Morwenna or Jo, but I obviously went to the 3 different countries over the 6 weeks, and I had about 70 meetings in different cities and towns across the US and Panama, and also obviously Geneva. And some of the sort of key organizations that I met were with the Indian Arts and Craft Board in this beautiful building in Washington, DC, which is housed at the Department of Interior. I also was very fortunate to go to the National Museum of American Indian, and they have a huge storage facility sort of outside of Washington, and has, I don't know, thousands of different Native American arts and craft work, which was just amazing to be able to see and to talk to the different curators and museum folk who work there. And then I was also fortunate enough to go to the Santa Fe Indian art markets, which are normally every August in Santa Fe. Santa Fe's the 3rd largest art market in the US, and it has a really strong Native American presence. And in the sort of landscape, in the cultural institutions there's something like 200 different galleries in this one road in Santa Fe. So it's got a really sort of rich history of that type of collaboration with the different sort of Native American groups in New Mexico, as well as the Spanish immigrants that were there, as well as other European immigrants. And so these amazing Native American art markets have over sort of 600 different artisans and practitioners. So I was able to talk to many of those artists and artisans to see how effective the Indian arts and craft law actually worked in the US, as well as talking to gallery owners and different academics as well. And then in Geneva, I went back to WIPO to sort of hear more about where the discussions were at in terms of protection of Indigenous culture at an international level, as well as going to the Ethnographic Museum as well. And so really some of the key recommendations that I found from my research were really that, you know, if you are going to have these specific laws implemented, the key kind of themes that they need to have in the laws need to protect communal ownership of Indigenous art and culture. There needs to be proper control for Indigenous people over their Indigenous art and culture. Also proper protection and recognition that Indigenous peoples are the one that should be maintaining and protecting their own Indigenous art and culture. And so I also found that there really needs to be proper government resourcing. I found with the Indian Arts and Craft Board, it was such a tiny sort of department within the Department of Interior. There was something like 6 staff that work in Washington, DC, and then Albuquerque in New Mexico and another city in the US. But they had very limited government resourcing to really sort of increase consumer awareness around these issues. And so if we were to see a law in Australia, there'd need to be proper government resourcing and then also proper powers for Indigenous people or government to stop that exploitation. And then we'd also want to see increased consumer awareness and education so that consumers buying Indigenous art at art fairs and galleries and markets know what to look for, know what type of questions to ask. And then we'd also want to see, we have a voluntary Indigenous art code at the moment, which promotes ethical sale for Indigenous businesses and artists working with dealers and galleries. So we'd want to see that mandatory in Australia as well. So there's some of the key findings that I found from my research. I might stop there and we might move on to the discussion part of our Churchill chat. So I'm going to start us off. We've got the 3 questions, as I mentioned, but I'm sort of looking really at the big topic around COVID and how COVID has really affected the world, obviously, at the moment, particularly those who are marginalised or minorities within countries. So we're seeing from closures of galleries to museums and festivals, disconnected remote Indigenous communities with limited internet to furloughed accessibility roles in institutions. How will our research bring about change during the pandemic? So Jo, shall I pass over to you?
Sure. How will my research solve COVID? It's an excellent question. I think, you know, it has been really interesting. I don't know if everybody saw the paper, the Sydney Morning Herald on the weekend. There was an article about, you know, the kind of skyrocketing levels of kind of mental health kind of reporting amongst young people. And I think that there's really been a lot of conversation that's been happening about young people and about the impact of COVID on them particularly. And it's been really quite, you know, it's been really terrifying, to be honest. And when COVID first hit last year, is it last year, COVID time? Yeah, it was last year. You know, I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art and I had 25 young people under my care and having to sort of pivot to online programming and really having to adjust expectations and how and where to be able to meet young people in terms of where they were at. It was really challenging but also in that there were opportunities to really give them a space because everything that the ways of working were just completely, it just weren't relevant anymore in terms of access to the museum, programming. And so it was really created this space for for them to really reflect on what they needed in that moment from each other, from their kind of community of peers, and to create programming spaces and opportunities online for them to really respond in real time to things that they were worried about. And so there is this whole online program that's still online if you are curious to sort of sit in on a live panel talk about amongst a bunch of teenagers talking about climate anxiety or mental health. It's all on the MCA's website still. But I think what's been really interesting, kind of fascinating for me to kind of watch over the last year has been all of this research that's been coming out. You know, that the news picked up some of it, but there was a paper earlier this year that the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare put out around Australia's youth and looking at the impact of COVID, looking at mental health, and the findings are really sobering around, you know, between February 2017 and April 2020, levels of severe psychological distress amongst 18 to 24-year-olds jumped from 14 to 22%. And Mission Australia, they do an annual survey where they reach out to over 25,000 teenagers across Australia to really get a measure of what it is that they're worried about, what they're thinking about, where their values are. And their report for 2020, you know, it was really the top 3 most important issues that they saw in Australia last year were equity and discrimination, which was 40%, up from 25% the year before, COVID, and mental health. And in terms of the 3 biggest personal issues that they were experiencing, it was concerns about education, it was mental health, and it was COVID. And what was really interesting for me in my fellowship was really about a lot of the work that these programs do to support young people's well-being and the holistic approach that they take to supporting young people and really what they're grappling with day to day. And I think for the arts sector, thinking about young people, you know, I think there's a lot of conversations that we need to be having about, you know, what is the role? Like, obviously we're all shut down right now, we're just trying to survive, but I think, you know, what is the role of the arts and culture sector, you know, to kind of contribute, you know, when it comes to this mental health crisis really that young people are experiencing. And, you know, the role of a museum is not to support young people's mental health and well-being, but these kinds of youth programs really can and do sit in that space of supporting young people in a way that is not school, that is not family, that is this really safe space that they get to kind of determine what that is for them. And I will be really interested over the coming months and years really to see how all of these conversations that are happening in the arts and in mental health and around education, and how we can start to look for opportunities to really support young people and meet them where they're at. So that's been my experience of COVID. You know, I think I had last year, over a 3-month period, 50 hours of Zoom meetings with teenagers who all sat there on mute with their hoodies up, and, you know, it was a lot. So, you know, but it really kind of an extraordinary time as well. So yeah, it's a lot really. But what about you, Morwenna and Trish? What have been some of your reflections and experiences of COVID?
Well, I'm going to flip it a little bit, Jo, because I think, you know, obviously COVID has been incredibly difficult for, you know, everyone in many different ways, but certainly for the disability and access community, there's actually been some silver linings in COVID. And, you know, it's removed the need to travel to inaccessible venues in the arts. It's brought the art to you, you know, for people with disability who might be housebound or bedridden. It's, you know, removed geographic barriers. It's removed some access barriers for some people. It's, you know, it's been a way, engaging with the arts online has been a way to do that safely while shielding if you're someone who's immunocompromised, for example. So, you know, there has been, there's definitely been some things to like, I think, for the disability community. And I think there's a fear, or there's a nervousness in my community now that, you know, at some point when things return, will they go back to the way they were, or have we learnt something from this time around access, you know, and are we going to take these learnings around access that we've gained sort of into what the future looks like. And, you know, an example of that is every time we see the 11 a.m. Gladys, there's an Auslan interpreter there and there's captioning, and, you know, it's sort of socialising the idea of access perhaps in a way, and giving it a platform that perhaps it hasn't had in the general public to this extent before. So there's been, yeah, there's definitely the conversation around access and inclusion has been brought to the fore, perhaps more so during this time. But something we also need to be mindful of is, of course, that online arts experiences aren't going to be accessible for everyone. There are some, you know, there are some people with disabilities, some people with certain conditions or impairments, you know, where online just doesn't work. We've got the whole digital inequality thing as well that Trish mentioned. So, you know, it's not the solution for everyone, and certainly not the solution for every circumstance. But I think, you know, my community is talking a lot about what does an inclusive recovery from COVID look like in the arts, and how do we make sure that we build back better and take these learnings around access and inclusion with us. And in a lot of ways also, you know, this enforced downtime that arts organisations have had, you know, some have obviously just had to be purely focused on survival, and understandably, you know, survival comes first. But others have kind of taken it as time and space to think about the things they never get to, like, let's look at some capital works to make my venue more accessible, or let's finally look at the digital accessibility of my website, or whatever it might be. And there's been some, you know, there's been a lot of COVID kind of arts money floating around, and certainly some arts organisations have used that to make access improvements. So I feel like, yeah, just that the conversation around access is heightened during this time, and certainly my hope is that we don't forget all the lessons that we've learned in the last little while. But Trish, what about you? What are you thinking around COVID? And
yeah, it sort of really depends who you talk to. I mean, I'm talking sort of specifically about the visual arts, First Nations visual arts sector. So if we're looking at sort of regional and remote communities, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of people talking about how, you know, they've sort of felt a bit excluded from some of the conversations that have happened, because, you know, everyone sort of down south in the big cities jumped on laptops and Zoom and, you know, MS Teams and whatever else. Whereas in regional and remote communities, people might not have access to, you know, good Wi-Fi or even a laptop, or even have an email account to access Zoom. So we're seeing and hearing that there are issues around that sort of digital inequality. And also a big issue that came up last year was the fear of losing elders and cultural custodians, where art and culture comes from. So we saw, which was a positive, that in a lot of Aboriginal remote communities, they shut down really, really early last year in March to sort of stop, you know, any sort of elders being lost because of COVID. But unfortunately now this year in Western New South Wales, we're seeing a lot of Aboriginal communities being threatened by this new Delta strain. So that's a sort of new issue that's popped up at the moment. But in terms of, I guess, the visual arts and what we've seen over the last year, because of the Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter movements, that a lot of people, you know, consumers aren't traveling, obviously, overseas for the next sort of year. So people are wanting to buy that big piece of artwork. And so we saw an increase in sales of Aboriginal artworks in galleries, art fairs, and even art centres in remote communities. And because people are wanting to, you know, spending more time at home and travelling to regional areas within their state, they're wanting to reflect and learn more about country as well, and hear more First Nations voices. For example, at the City Writers Festival earlier this year, there was quite a large First Nations program, which was really great to see lots of First Nations writers and storytellers part of that program. So sort of going back to my research, if we do want to provide these kind of economic benefits for First Nations people in the arts to be able to tell their stories and paint, we do need to have those specific laws in place to protect First Nations arts and culture, to help support these voices in the arts sector.
That feels like kind of quite a nice segue into really talking about, I think, this idea around equity. And I think we've touched on sort of digital inequity and other things. And Trish, you just mentioned, you know, Black and Indigenous Lives Matters. And I think that was certainly something that, you know, is a conversation and a social movement that's been ongoing for a number of years now. But I think with everything that happened in the US last year, it really brought a lot of these conversations around equity and access and social justice really to the front of a lot of people, particularly in the arts and culture sector. It really made those conversations unavoidable in ways that were, I think, uncomfortable for a lot of people, but are hopefully going to continue to be quite productive. And, you know, and in thinking of, you know, in the pre-chat chats we've had and, you know, and thinking about this issue, was really interesting for me to reflect on the fact that historically a lot of these youth arts programs that I saw were really created in response to significant structural inequalities in America, you know, in the absence of federally funded programming, or, you know, the problems with the justice system and inequitable health, immigration, all of these things, you know, philanthropy really stepped into that void, and you know, museums and galleries, like they do, followed the funding. And so a lot of these programs were really grounded in ideas around social justice and the development of 21st century skills and this idea about equity. And, you know, and I think before COVID, you know, a lot of the institutions we were working with, you know, there were access and inclusion plans and reconciliation plans, and a lot of these things were in place. But I think, you know, the status quo was maybe sort of fundamentally not really looking to budge or kind of concede any space at the table. And I feel like that's really changed now as a result of COVID. And, you know, we're talking about access and we're talking about inclusion and diversity and equity, which are all quite nuanced, complex terms in and of themselves. And, you know, but we're also now talking about, you know, decolonizing spaces, and we're starting to really publicly interrogate, you know, who holds the power and who's granting that access, and who's inviting these other communities in, and who's not being included. And I know that in the First Nations space and the disability sector, and certainly working with young people, there's this idea of nothing about us without us. And I'm really interested, Tricia and Morwenna, about, you know, what if there were any particular findings in your fellowships around these conversations about equity and inclusion that are shaping kind of where you're sitting today and the conversations that you're happening. And if you've just, I mean, what your own experiences or reflections have been over the last year on these really complex but important conversations.
Yeah, I think I was really surprised, but also pleased to see in Panama. You know, I said earlier that the Kuna people they're very strong advocates in Panama, and they were the ones that actually drove a lot of these discussions to have that new law implemented in Panama back in 2000. So a lot of the Kuna lawyers and advocates and academics that worked with their community, and they also have like cultural authorities within their lands. They were really the ones driving these First Nations value and the importance of protecting culture, and you know, the specific mollas that the Kuna women embroid and make and sell at their artistic markets in Panama. And so it was really eye-opening to see that this sort of cultural revolution started back, well, before 2000, and the Kuna people really sort of drove this legislative change. Anytime they hear about a company or an organization or a seller selling mollas without permission from the Kuna people, they will and try and get government support to take a company to court. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Nike actually wanted to use a molla within one of their sneakers. And it was the Kuna lawyers who worked pro bono for their community to really sort of push First Nations values. And they wrote to Nike and said, you know, there's a law in Panama that stops outsiders misusing our mollas. So you have to stop selling this shoe. And obviously Nike is an American company, so the law doesn't extend to the US. But Nike actually listened to these Panamanian lawyers and really sort of came up with a way forward on how they might work with the Kaurna people in the future. So I think it's really about this sort of, we're seeing this new sort of horizon almost. Are people willing to sort of have those uncomfortable conversations and move aside and let these different voices, First Nations voices, come to the forefront and take on these roles, and really try and take into account these kind of cultural and spiritual values that we see from First Nations people here, but also overseas as well.
Oh, that is a cool example, Trish. So cool. And go the Panama lawyers. Great. Jo, you mentioned before the whole nothing about us without us thing, which I think, you know, all of our sort of diverse communities, you know, that resonates with in various ways. And, you know, another thing kind of on that riff is this idea of with, by and for, you know, developing programs with, by and for. And certainly, you know, the great programs that I visited were excellent examples of that. And I suppose, you know, thinking about the spotlight that is being placed more heavily on diversity and inclusion now, you know, why is that happening? And I think, you know, is it the carrot and stick approach? I think the stick is definitely helping. Funding bodies, you know, the Australia Council and state and even local funders now are very much kind of prioritising diversity and inclusion in grant funding in a way that we haven't seen before. You know, it was great to see last year the new major performing arts framework really get diversity and inclusion in there for all of our large arts and cultural organisations. And I suppose because of this pressure from funders, you know, a lot more arts organisations have been planning and working and thinking about what can we do in this space. And you're right, Jo, you know, I think previously there were a lot of diversity and inclusion plans probably gathering a bit of dust on shelves in arts organisations. And I feel like it is an area that is, you know, being activated in a way that we haven't seen before. I think sometimes, you know, and as Jo said, there's so many different words around this: social justice, equity, you know, diversity, access and inclusion, all the things. Sometimes it can be a challenge because it's really broad. There's a lot of underrepresented groups out there, and how do arts organisations engage with those different communities in meaningful ways? And, you know, sometimes I think there's decisions to be made around, you know, do you try and tackle all of them all at once, or do you focus on, you know, one at a time or a few? And, you know, no right answers there, but I think we're seeing different approaches to that. When I think back to my fellowship, one of the things I sort of reflected on is, well, why do I do the work that I do? Why do I care about this? Why is this important to me? And, you know, to me, diverse art is absolutely the best art. You know, it's the most exciting, it's the most risk-taking, it's different, it's experimental, it's fun, it's engaging. And I love seeing artwork that reflects the society that we live in, and it makes the arts real and meaningful. And so I'm really pleased to see that, you know, it is a focus that we're seeing. And so I was interested through the fellowship, well, you know, why do arts organisations internationally, why do they do this work? What is in it for them? And the four kind of main reasons that I came up with, talking to my millions of organisations, were absolutely number one for most, it was the moral imperative. Most people do this work because they think it's the right thing to do, to work with different communities and be, you know, arts organisations always talk about relevance and being relevant to their communities. Followed very closely by the second reason of funding and legislative requirements. Certainly in my space, you know, disability discrimination and other areas too is incredibly rife. You know, the Australian Human Rights Commission, if 40% of its complaints are related to disability discrimination, it's huge, and it's still a massive issue here. The other two reasons came up not as much as I would have liked, but those other two reasons were artistic rationales. And I think, you know, artistic directors and curators really starting to understand the artistic benefits of diversity and inclusion. And the fourth reason, which is talked about heaps in the UK, and I really want it to become more of a conversation here, is this idea of the business case for inclusion. By being inclusive, you know, you can have more bums on seats, you can sell more tickets, you know. In the UK, they talk about this figure called the purple pound, which is the spending power of disabled households in the UK, which is something like 250 billion pounds annually, you know, so people have money to burn. So they were, you know, there's some of the reasons I think why the arts is doing this work. And I really want those conversations, you know, particularly around the artistic rationale and the business case to you know, be more at the forefront of our discussions around diversity and inclusion here in Australia.
I'm really mindful of the time, so I won't, I will just say for anybody that is kind of curious about what young people are bringing to this conversation around equity and justice, Google Teen Council's Teen Vogue. There's a really fantastic article that was written last September that summarises a lot of the work and activism that these youth councils at museums across North America were really doing to agitate for kind of equity and the kind of the Black Lives Matter kind of conversation. And it's exhilarating or terrifying depending on where you sort of sit in the museum sort of scale. But yeah, that would be my go-to direction for that part of that conversation.
Thanks, Jo. Well, let me finish this off before we move into a Q&A with our last kind of discussion question that we had, which is around the future and what is the way forward for the arts when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, particularly interested in hearing what you two think the future looks like, and also what you're working on now that you're excited about to see this develop in the future.
Go, Trish.
Sure. I'll go first. So there's been a lot of really interesting decolonising conversations with institutions. I had about 3 Zoom meetings last week with North American colleagues. And, you know, we saw, I don't know if anyone saw that program about the Met a couple of weeks ago on the ABC. And we're also talking with our sister organisation, the Canada Council for the Arts, and also the Massachusetts Cultural Centre. And they're sort of really looking at, well, if you're a colonial institution, how do you really sort of shift the lens and the voice to other people? Do you need to have these uncomfortable conversations before you get to a point that can be inclusive and equal for all people to be included in exhibitions, in staffing, in any sort of policies and processes? So that's some of the sort of interesting conversations and forums that we're sort of working on at the moment at the Australia Council. There's been a lot of work also around the protocols for First Nations arts and culture. Because of that lack of legal protection for Indigenous art and culture, we've worked with one of the leading experts, Dr. Terry Jenke, in developing the 3rd edition of the protocols that she originally wrote for us back in 2002 at the Australia Council. So again, we're seeing a lot of arts and cultural institutions wanting to learn more about protocols, and also having a culturally safe place to be able to include First Nations people within these institutions, to have that self-determined voice and values in all conversations. A really exciting win at the moment is the Australian curriculum peak body ACARA will also be placing the protocols at the centre of the arts curriculum for year 7 to 9. So that was a really interesting sort of discussion that we had earlier this year. And then also a fun one that I'll be doing later this year is talking about the protocols at the Romance Writers Conference. Who would have thought? So that's going to also be a really interesting conversation around how romance writers implement protocols and have sort of appropriate representations and stories around Indigenous people and themes. Should romance writers be including these types of stories within their books? So that's one I'm looking forward to as well. But I'm also doing some work at the government level with IP Australia, which is a government agency that looks after trademarks and patents and designs and plant breeders' rights. So they've done a lot of work around protection of traditional knowledge, and I'm part of the Indigenous expert panel that looks at some of the changes that's happening in that space. There's also a committee that's looking at a scoping study to look at new laws for protection of Indigenous cultural rights, and part of my research has also been used in some of the work that this committee is looking at as well. But I guess just finally, 3 sort of key takeaways. If you're looking to buy authentic, ethical Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander arts, look at First Nations arts and cultural centres across the country. We've got amazing art fairs as well in Darwin, in Sydney, Cairns, Alice Springs, Brisbane and Perth. So look out for those opportunities to buy some art if you're interested. And then the Indigenous Art Code as well has a lot of information on their website around consumer awareness and how to, what type of questions to ask in terms of authentic and ethical art. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I have just wrapped up 7 months as part of a peer learning community with 14 other museum educators from across the US, which was an opportunity that came out of my fellowship. So for the last 7 months, I've been getting up at 5:30 in the morning every 3 weeks to join a lot of my peers across North America to really unpack and reflect on the state of youth arts programming, museums, how they're responding to the kind of social situation that the world is in right now, politically and in every other way, and really trying to develop a sort of some kind of pedagogies or ways of teaching or thinking and supporting museum educators who specifically work with young people, and how you really sit in the museum space and advocate for and support young people while grappling with the bigger machinations of a museum. I mean, I think there was a lot of conversation about good trouble and allyship and how you can really navigate that space. So for the next sort of 6 months, I'm going to be working with them on a how-to kit for museum educators wanting to work and support young people in that informal learning space. So I'm really excited about that, and that's been a fellowship outcome that I couldn't have anticipated. But to be the only international person as part of that conversation has been really exciting to have that insight into these really great people in America. And then I've also been having a lot of conversations, really leveraging off my Churchill report with different museums and galleries around Australia, helping them to write funding applications to get fledgling youth programs up off the ground, really trying to think about what youth engagement looks like in the arts sector in Australia. So really trying to kind of build capacity and support conversations like that, which is really, an interesting time, as I said, to be having those conversations while a lot of people are just trying to keep the doors open. And then, really just doing a lot of writing and thinking. And I think really what I'm looking for, the 2 things I'm looking forward to, I think, is sort of keeping on tracking all of this research that's coming in around the kind of impacts, particularly for young people of COVID, and trying to really de-silo a lot of this expertise and research that's coming in, and trying to identify where those opportunities are. But mostly I'm just really looking forward to going back into museums and galleries, and going to the theatre. I think that's fairly high up the list.
Oh, absolutely, Jo. Echo that 100%. So lucky I snuck in my trip to Hamilton the week before lockdowns. That was great. Can't wait to get back in the theatre too. I think when it comes to music and disability, sort of what I'm seeing at the moment is a lot more music organisations employing access coordinators, putting on disability advisory groups, seeing a real kind of growth in that area. Engaging me as a consultant a lot more, which is great. It's definitely something that music organisations are starting to think more about. And I guess that was a gap that I saw when coming back from my fellowship, which sort of made me quit my day job at the Australia Council and realise that someone needed to, you know, be able to hold organisations' hands to do this important work. And you know, pleased to say that that's, you know, that's obviously working out for me, but really pleased that organisations are absolutely starting and continuing to prioritise this. So I think we'll see more exciting things to come. I think my arts practice background being classical music's definitely got a way to go in this, and is definitely having more conversations about it. I think contemporary music, you know, doing some exciting work at the moment with Music New South Wales and Music Victoria to look at live music venue accessibility, so that when we do reopen, hopefully live music venue websites will be accessible. And you know, we're working towards sort of capital works funding to make some significant access improvements for some venues. So that's really exciting. Now, we wanted to open up the conversation now for Q&A, and I think we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box already that we can start with. But if anyone that's with us here tonight, if you want to enter any questions you've got for us in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you about what you're interested in, or if there's anything you'd like to find out more. And Trish, I can see a question here for you. I don't know if you can see it as well, but the ACARA protocol that you were talking about, someone's just asked whether that is just visual arts or if that extends to other art form areas such as music in the school curriculum.
Yes, I think I had a discussion with ACARA very early this year, so I'm just trying to go back and think what was in the presentation. But I think they were sort of looking more specifically at visual arts, and they were looking at sort of other protocols for other kind of subjects like science and history and so on. But I'll have to double check that. Yeah.
It's a good question to know whether it's art form wide, or, you know, some can tend to have a visual arts flavour at times in this area.
Yeah, I know because NAVA early sort of mid this year also in their sort of submission to ACARA, they also asked for the protocols to be implemented within the visual arts curriculum. But yeah, I'll have to double check that one. That's a good question. Thanks.
I've got another question in here, just from someone asking if I could expand a little bit more on making music dementia friendly, which is one of the things I mentioned early on. And yeah, it's absolutely something, particularly in the UK and particularly weirdly in classical music, they're thinking about a lot. I guess a lot of classical music audiences, as we know, tend to be older, so it's good that they're thinking in that way. And I think when it comes to dementia friendly programs, what generally works is having something that's for quite a period of time, like a term, sort of your 8 to 10 weeks kind of thing. Obviously very regular in terms of day and time and location and those sorts of things. Having music, working with the participants around what music resonates with them. So potentially having conversations before a program with carers or family members who can help point people in the direction to the right sort of music to be using. Programs sometimes get participants making music themselves, either if they're musicians or even if they're not. There are other ways to make music together. And also quite a few of the programs were incorporating movement as well. And Jo, I know there's, dementia-friendly visual arts is a big thing too, and I'm sure the MCA, did the MCA have a dementia program?
Yeah, the MCA has a dementia program. The NGA, I think, have had a dementia program for a number of years now, and actually are capacity building out to support and run programs for a lot of regional galleries. But the Art Gallery of New South Wales, most major state institutions will have some sort of offering in that art and dementia space. And they're really innovative, brilliant programs. And a lot of it's had to move online too last year. So working with carers and with different kind of arts health bodies to really figure out the best way to do that. I have a question here that's come through directly to me, which was about more about the benefits of informal learning. Because in their opinion, young ones are getting far too much formal education, and I'm sure they would agree with you. I think what's really exciting and transformative about these informal youth-led learning spaces is that they really, when they are authentically led by young people, there is a framework or a support that's offered by the institution, but then it's really that responsibility and that opportunity is really given over to the young people themselves to decide what it is that they want to do or to respond to. And it might be an exhibition, it might be something that's happened in the kind of broader moment, it might be a climate strike, whatever it is. And I think some of the research and certainly from my own experiences of supporting these programs is, depending on what it is, there are opportunities for young people to develop their leadership skills, their confidence, public speaking, digital skills, teamwork, all of these sort of soft skills. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting in a lot of the research that's coming out is around the importance of creativity as a 21st century skill, and how critical creativity is going to be to future kind of innovation, jobs growth, tech, all of, I think the Australia Council's got a report out just this week about sort of creativity in the workforce, and this real recognition that creative skills and critical and creative thinking skills are really, whether or not you go on to become an artist, there is something in these spaces for young people to really benefit from. And I think that one of the things that they also teach, which is really important, is about kind of really positive risk taking, and learning how to fail and how to ideate and come up with something else, and how to really sit in and understand difficult, complex ideas without there being a right or a wrong. And there's lots of research that's referenced in my Churchill Fellowship report around some of that longer term impact. And I think what's also interesting for the arts is that there's a lot of research as well, and certainly a report that I co-authored at MCA spoke to this, is that actually those young people that participate in these programs go on to support and invest and participate in the arts as well. So again, coming back to that sort of thing that you were talking about, Morwenna, about the business case, I think development teams love to hear about the fact that if a young person participates in these programs, they're more likely to donate to an arts organisation in the future than if they didn't. So there's so many benefits to participating that really, you can be interested in science or maths or you're cripplingly shy. These programs will really meet a young person where they're at and address their needs and support them if they do it well.
Great. I've also got a question here. So the question is, does protecting Indigenous cultural IP help preserve Indigenous cultures themselves? So in terms of what I saw from the Indian Arts and Craft Act and the work that the Indigenous Arts and Craft Board do, that act is really to stop the exploitation of inauthentic or fake Native American art, and to really give Native American communities the opportunity to be able to pass on that knowledge to the next generation of artists and artisans and jewelry makers. And so I think having a specific law around protection of Indigenous cultural IP, while it's kind of not like the main focus of that law, because IP laws are really sort of around protection and being able to exploit your creation for economic return. So the main focus isn't really sort of around preservation, but it's a sort of indirect outcome, I guess, of implementing a new type of law in Australia to address the issues around protection and maintenance. And I know at the international level, so WIPO is the UN specialised agency in Geneva that works on international IP laws. But at the international level, there's also UNESCO, which does focus on preservation of cultural heritage and also intangible cultural heritage, for example, like songs and stories and language. And so there's been a lot of work at the UNESCO level around protection, around preservation of culture and intangible heritage. So we see sort of all these different examples around the world where we can draw on those examples and have a robust discussion and really sort of implement a new type of law that would almost try and marry what we call customary practice or protocols. The protocols are really a sort of an embodiment of customary practice within Aboriginal communities and bringing together Western law, so your IP laws, and really sort of bring it together and come up with a new type of law that would help to protect and also preserve Indigenous art and culture.
Have we got any more questions? I don't have any more in my chat box. If the two of you don't, we might hand back over to Ian to sort of wrap up.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Always love chatting with you both.
Yes, right back at you.
Yeah.
I'll just unmute myself. Can I just say it's been fascinating just sitting back and hearing three people who are so passionate about what they believe. And I think everyone listening in would agree that your passion has come through. And that's true of all Churchill Fellows. Churchill Fellows are people who want to make a difference in the world. And you are showing by your work and what you're doing and your passion that you want to make a difference and you are making a difference. So can I just say on behalf of everyone, it has been great to have this opportunity. I'm just going to remove the spotlights. I'm going to allow if people do want to put their cameras back on. It just takes me a second to get the permissions back up. Oh, there we go. There's the security. I'm allowing everyone to start videos if they want to, and if you want to go to gallery view and turn your video back on, you can all give a smile and a wave. But while you're all coming back on, can I just ask, first of all, Peter, Mary and Elizabeth Comino, can you please give a big wave, Peter and Elizabeth? Those two people who are waving there, they're on our Churchill Fellows Association. It's the two of them that organise these chats, that make the contacts and bring it all together and get it all out. So can I just say a big thank you on behalf of everyone to Peter and Elizabeth for pulling this together. It's been a fun night. Three of you tonight have mentioned your reports. Now, your reports are available online, that's correct? Giving a big nods, yeah. So don't forget, if you want to go to the Churchill Trust in Canberra, it's a great website. You can put their names in and you can actually look at their reports. They are public domain, and like all Churchill Fellows, the hundreds and hundreds of reports are there online for the world to see. So it might be a good time to go on and look at the three reports from Morwenna, Trish and Jo and just do a bit of follow-up. If you do have any further questions, by all means, contact them direct. If you're not sure how to contact them, you can contact through us, the association here. Our email is secretary at NSW Churchill Fellows. It's all one word. Anyway, or Google it, get in touch. We'll pass those questions on. Just want to mention one more thing, a bit of an ad. If any of you are in Queensland, don't forget I'm mentioning that because I should be saying if you're anywhere in Australia, we'd love you to come to the conference, which is being held in Queensland in October. The reality is, I think for many of us, particularly those of us in New South Wales, I think the reality is that we may not be permitted into Queensland to that conference. I have been told that there will be an online version as well. So those of us in New South Wales who won't be able to visit, we will be able to participate in an online capacity. But other states, I think there is still possibilities that you will be able to travel to that convention. It's on the 8th, 9th, 10th of October in Brisbane. Just Google it, Churchill Fellows National Convention. If you haven't been to a national convention, please make sure you make the effort. It is an amazing experience. I'm just so sad that many of us won't be able to be there. We think if you do decide to register, they have made a great decision. They've said that I think up until a day or so before the conference, you can get a full refund. So if you do register for the conference and find that you are not able to travel and whatever, you will be able to get a full refund right up until the date of the conference. So if you are interested, look at that. Once again, thank you to every one of you. Can I get you all to give a big thumbs up to Morwenna, Trish and Jo? Thanks for that, guys. It's been wonderful. The event has finished. If anybody wants to unmute and chat and talk, I'm happy to leave the Zoom meeting open for a free-for-all. If you want to say hi to each other, I think you should be able to unmute. Yeah, I've allowed permission to unmute yourself and start your videos. We have finished. Thanks, everybody. But if you'd like to stay and chat, please unmute and say hi to each other.